Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan Gil Harris. I'm an author and a teacher based in Delhi, and I'm delighted to be talking with you today about my book, The Girl from Fergana, which has been picked by Sonali to be the book of the month for the Sonali's Book Club. I'm very, very grateful to Sonali for thinking of my book and promoting it. And it really is a pleasure to be here. Just a little bit about me. I'm born in New Zealand, but I was born in New Zealand, but I have migrated around the world. I lived in England, I lived in America for 23 years, and I moved to Delhi in 2013 with finality. So I've been here for 13 years now. And I've been writing in the time I've been here. I've had a number of books. Some of you may know my book, The First Ferengis, which was about people like me who migrated to India, but before the age of colonialism. Europeans and one African and one East Asian who migrated to India and became Indian. My next book was Masala Shakespeare, about another Ferengi who has somehow become Indian thanks to the enormous popularity of his stories in Indian popular culture and film. If you've seen Omkara, Makbul, Haider, if you've seen Ram Leela, if you've seen Gulzar's wonderful film Angur, you'll know that Shakespeare adapts almost seamlessly into Indian languages and film traditions. But it's my most recent book that I'm here to talk about today, The Girl from Fergana. There it is again. And it's a rather different book. It's a much more personal story. It's a memoir of my mother, who was born in Warsaw in the early 1930s. But she probably would have stayed there the rest of her life if history hadn't intervened. And the storms of history relocated her first to Lvov, and she was deported from there in 1941 by the Soviets to a labor camp in Siberia, where she spent a year before she was deported again by the Soviets to Central Asia, to the Fergana Valley. And she lived there for 5 years before moving to Palestine. The part that she lived in eventually became Israel. Then she moved to England and then to New Zealand, where she had me and I entered the story. But the book is a memoir of my mother, and in particular, the 5 years that she spent in the Fergana Valley. It's a place that most Indians have at least heard of, because Fergana occupies a very special place in the Indian historical imagination. It was the birthplace of Babur, the first Mughal emperor. But it wasn't just because of the contact between Babur that Fergana has been such an important reference point for Indians. There has been a long and rich history of cultural as well as commercial exchange between North India in particular and Central Asia, particularly the Fergana Valley territory. So my book is a memoir of my mother and the time she spent in the Fergana Valley, but it's also a lot more than that. It's also a history of an unusual kind. The Fergana Valley was the beating heart of the Silk Roads that connected China, India, Persia, and Europe. But the Fergana Valley was right at the center and was the point at which Chinese merchants would turn off to go to India or carry on to move to Persia. And interestingly, the Silk Roads was a place where, across its breadth, where Jews have lived from Persia to India to China for thousands of years. So I was interested in writing the history of a Polish Jew who moved to the Fergana Valley, and unbeknownst to her, was walking in the footsteps of many other Jews who had lived there before her. So keeping all that in mind, I want to turn to the questions that readers have asked me about the book. And again, I want to say how grateful I am to Sonali for taking on this book as the book of the month, because amongst other things, apart from giving me a platform to talk about the book, it's also meant that I've received some very, very interesting questions. These questions have helped me think a little bit more about what I'm doing with the book, why I'm doing it, and what readers might be making of the book. When you write a book, you're writing it for yourself, but in the hope that it will find an audience. You never know quite what the audience is going to do with the book, and they're always going to find meanings in it. They're always going to find aspects of it interesting, speaking to them in ways that, as a writer, you simply can't predict. And that's true with the questions I've received. So let's start with the first question from the enigmatically named Whispers of a Reader, who asked, "What was the most surprising discovery you made while uncovering your mother's story, and how did it change your understanding of your own identity?" That's a beautiful question and a really tough one to answer, for the simple reason that I made so many discoveries that I never expected to make. The subtitle of the book is Secrets of My Mother's Chinese Tea Chest. Let me tell you a little bit about that. When I was growing up, our living room in New Zealand was very sparsely decorated. My parents were refugees, after all, and they hadn't carried much with them from their previous lives. But there was one item that connected my mother to her childhood in Poland and her subsequent lives in the Fergana Valley in Palestine. It was an intricately carved camphor antique tea chest from China that my mother's Uncle Joe had probably picked up in Shanghai or Hong Kong on one of his business trips. And we were never allowed to open the chest when we were children, my sisters and I. And that's because the chest contained all the documents, photos, letters that my mother had somehow managed to save from her childhood. I knew that because I'd often looked closely at the chest and prized it open a little bit, looking over my shoulder to see if my mother was looking, and rummaged a little bit, and I'd seen photos, I'd seen letters and languages that I didn't understand. The problem was that all these documents were buried deep, not only in sawdust, but also naphthalene. And the smell of the naphthalene would waft out of the Chinese tea chest. And every time I opened it, that smell would alert my mother, and she'd come swooping in and slam the tea chest shut and say, "Please don't, please don't." It's not that my mother didn't want us to know about her past. It was that she herself was so traumatized by the multiple losses she'd experienced. She'd lost her entire family during the war, most of them in the Nazi death camps, Auschwitz and Treblinka. But she also lost her parents in Fergana. They're both buried in the Fergana Valley. So she was orphaned at the age of 9, and she carried a huge amount of trauma with her. Now, when I was growing up, this is all leading to my answer to your question. When I was growing up, I spoke Polish and Hebrew with my mother, but at a certain point, my parents decided, this was the 1960s, that I should only be spoken to in English, because the world outside in New Zealand spoke only English. And the received wisdom at that time was that if a child grew up speaking many languages, it would interfere with their intellectual development. That was then. We think very differently now. So I have the Polish of a 3-year-old, the Hebrew of a 1.5-year-old. But I always admired my mother's linguistic ability. She spoke so many different languages. She was born into a Polish-speaking family, but she spoke Romanian with her sister because her sister had been born in Romania. She spoke Yiddish with the servants in her very bourgeois Polish household. She spoke German with her parents, who had, at least her mother, had grown up speaking German. She spoke French at the dinner table because that was considered the language of etiquette and politesse for a bourgeois Jewish girl in Warsaw. Subsequently, she learned Russian in Siberia and in Fergana, but she also picked up Uzbek there. And I knew that she spoke Uzbek, but it didn't really register for me because I just thought Uzbek, it's a strange language that people in Central Asia speak. My mother contracted Alzheimer's in about 2016, 2017. And the horrible thing about Alzheimer's is that it ravages the memory and works through it from the most recent memories and then moves back through time to the earliest ones. So my mother began to forget the many languages that she'd learned in the reverse order that she'd learned them. So the first language to go was the last one she'd learned, English, which was devastating for me because I'd grown up speaking and loving my mother in English. And so I desperately missed the mother who had loved me back in English. She would speak to me in Polish and Hebrew. I'd understand some. But every now and then, she'd speak in Uzbek. And I'd known she could speak it, but it was only after I moved to India in 2013 and began to learn Hindi and Urdu that I realized that Uzbek is in some ways a sister language of Hindi and Urdu, of Hindustani. And whereas before the Uzbek that my mother had spoken when I was small made no sense to me, all of a sudden, once she had Alzheimer's, certain words would leap out of her Uzbek. So what she found difficult was mushkil for her, as it was for me. If she found it easy, it was asan, as it was for me. She would speak about sabzi, gosht, mirch, foodstuffs that she'd learned the names of in the bazaar in the Fergana Valley, where she spent a lot of her time as a child. There were other words, kayamat, for a catastrophe. She told me that her mother was buried in a kabristan. And most movingly, mohabbat. She would still, despite her Alzheimer's, express deep love for me. But sometimes the word she chose was the Uzbek, mohabbat, which is of course also a Hindi and Urdu word. It took me moving to India to be able to understand my mother after she lost English. It's proof love does cross borders. And this book is all about the ridiculousness of the borders that we live within. So I hope that answers your question, Whispers of a Reader. The next question comes from Anu Somian. And she asks, in your book, what aspects require particular caution while writing a memoir? Specifically, which topics or details should a writer avoid over-elaborating on, as they may bore readers, mislead them, or lead to misinterpretation of the work? Well, that's an interesting question. Of course, I think of my readers while I'm writing. I don't want to write something that is so impenetrable that it puts them off. But the fact is, one always makes a bit of a wager with one's readers. If one writes simply thinking, oh, what will my readers like? You don't get to write at all. One has to follow one's impulses, trust one's gut feelings about what the story itself needs to do. Now, in my case, the story, yes, it was a memoir of my mother. And so it was an attempt to piece together in kind of chronological sequence the details of her life, including many details that I hadn't known when I was growing up, but which items in the Chinese tea chest allowed me to understand with more clarity. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, I was trying to understand my mother in the context of this much deeper, longer 2,500-year history of Jewish presence on the Silk Roads. That too was one of the biggest discoveries for me, that although my mother was born in Europe and was in many ways very European identified in terms of the literature she loved, the music she loved to listen to, she was also very much an Asian person. And not just because of the 5 years that she spent in Fergana, but because of the Asian legacy that is part of Jewish tradition and culture, thanks to the Silk Road's presence in Jewish history. Now, writing that history meant, that Silk Road's history, meant I spent a lot of time thinking about historical detail that is counterintuitive, complex, and very remote from modern experience. I had to be careful that that historical detail didn't overwhelm the story I was telling about my mother. Because, I'm an academic, I'm a professor, I love detail. And I would disappear down rabbit holes of academic interest to me that I would then realize a little bit down the road, perhaps this doesn't need to be in my mother's story. So for instance, I found a painting that my mother's Uncle Joe had done of a village in Libya, or what had become Libya. It was a place where, again, Jewish merchants had passed through, and it wasn't the Silk Roads, but it was part of the trade tributary that linked the Silk Roads to southern Spain, or Al-Andalus, where there was also a very rich Jewish presence. So I wrote chapters on the Sephardic Jews of North Africa until I realized, no, maybe this is not particularly relevant to my mother's story. I wrote chapters about the fascinating mixed Jewish-Muslim history of Kaifeng in China, but again, it wasn't quite connected to my mother's story. So more and more, I had to narrow down that Silk Road's history to thinking about the cultures that ended up in the Fergana Valley. The Fergana Valley was only 0.2% of Central Asia's landmass, but it contains 20% of Central Asia's population because it's a very fertile area. Baba remembered it as a land of pomegranates and deer. But it's a place that many different cultures have settled in. Persians, Greeks, Chinese, Tibetans, Turks, Indians, Jews. And so what I wanted to do was write about this extraordinary confluence of cultures that was still evident to my mother when she arrived in the Fergana Valley, in a place that had never really known national borders. So yes, that was the big challenge for me, was to make sure that history didn't absolutely swamp the book to the point where my mother's story became invisible. And so, as you will have noticed reading the book, I keep pivoting between little fragments of my mother's story and fragments from history, which is unusual for readers who might want simply a straight linear narrative. But what I'm trying to suggest is, as I write in the book, all of us carry deep history in our pockets without our even realizing it. And to tell the story of one life, one often has to think about the larger historical forces, the ripple effects that have taken 2,500 years to turn a person into who they are. So having fragments of my mother's life story side by side with fragments of history was an attempt to give more depth to our sense of who she was, my sense of who she was, and more depth to our understanding of Jews and Jewishness. This is a history of Jews, but not a history as we might assume it to be, of one people who have somehow, against the odds, survived, clung to an unchanging identity for so many thousands of years. No, that's not the story I'm telling. It's instead the story of Jewish adaptation to other cultures who they live side by side with. And this is a story of how Jewish identity was completely transformed by its encounter with Zoroastrianism, how Jewish identity was completely transformed by its 1,200-year history of neighborliness with Muslims and Islamic cultures. And keeping that in mind helps us think with a little bit more complexity in this current moment, where we think of Jew and Muslim, or Israel and Iran, as absolutely opposed identities. It's only by going back into history we realize how much what we see as opposed have always been part of each other. So the next question is from Jums Pats. How has this book changed you? Well, I don't know if it's changed me in any profound way. I certainly can't give you a snappy, magical answer. But this book is a love letter to my mother. It's a love letter to the Silk Roads. It's a love letter to an age where we did not yet live in, I think, the suffocating straitjackets of ethnic nation states. It's a labor of love, reproducing these worlds for my readers. And I think it's also a work of mourning for my mother, who I lost while I was writing the book. This book has changed me because it's allowed me to mourn my mother. I think I would have had a very different trajectory through my grief if I hadn't been writing this book and if it wasn't out in the world now. It hasn't made me happy. My grief is very strong. But it's a grief not simply for the loss of the mother who I loved so deeply. It's grief also for the loss of a world in which neighbors who prayed to different gods, spoke different languages, ate different food. These neighbors weren't on the other side of a border. They weren't presented to us by the nation states that we now inhabit as enemies. They were instead part of who we are. We think of identity so much in terms of clans, ethnicities, and also ancestry. I am who I am, I'm Jewish, because my ancestors were Jewish. But what this book made me realize, and this is my answer to your question, the way in which it changed me was that I realized I'm Jewish not simply because I have Jewish ancestors. I'm Jewish also because my mother had Muslim neighbors. I'm Jewish also because her ancestors had Zoroastrian neighbors. And my identity is not something self-contained, already given to me as something static. Rather, it's dynamic and the result of conversation and dialogue with others who aren't Jewish. None of us are one. We all have two parents, which means already there's plurality seeping into us. But if we can expand our imaginations, expand our hearts, and recognize the truth of the way in which we live in the world, we'll realize that not only does it take a village to raise a child, it takes a Silk Road network to produce any identity. Zinsania M. Heter, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but that's what happens with Instagram handles. She asks, while writing The Girl from Fergana, was there a moment where your perception of your mother completely changed? Well, again, that's a lovely question. The truth is, my perception of my mother kept changing so many times as a result of what I was finding in her tea chest, what I was finding in my research. Let me tell you a story that will put into perspective what I'm about to say. So, when I was young, my mother impressed on me and my sisters that if there's a lesson of the Holocaust, it's not that this must never happen again to Jews. Of course it must never happen again to Jews. But it mustn't happen again to anyone. And as a result, my mother inculcated in us a deep sense of responsibility to speaking out against social injustice anywhere in the world. When I was a child, she took me on anti-apartheid marches. She took me on protests in support of Māori land rights in New Zealand. So this was very much part of my childhood, a strong sense that anyone, anywhere can be at the receiving end of injustice. When I was about 12, I brightly piped up at the dinner table one day, having read the news about what was happening in the Middle East. I said, "Ima," that's what I called my mother, "I think I support Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Liberation Organization because clearly the Palestinians are being at the receiving end of injustice." Silence. My mother looked hurt, as if I'd punched her. My sisters told me off. My father took me to task for being emotionally insensitive. He said, "Please don't hurt your mother." And she didn't speak to me for a few days. Because even though my mother said the lesson of the Holocaust was that this must never happen to anyone again, she was also a Zionist who believed that Israel was a nation that needed to be defended against Palestinians, who had, in her mind, come to take the place of earlier generations of enemies of Jews, like the Nazis. I never quite worked out how my mother, who was so sensitive to the suffering of others, couldn't quite see the suffering of the Palestinians. And this resulted in many arguments between us in my adult life. I think writing this book has helped me understand better, not so much my mother's Zionism per se, because I'd always understood that her Zionism was a product of the deep trauma that she'd gone through, a desire after being orphaned to have something of a parent figure in the form of the Israeli nation state that would look after her, tend to her needs, protect her. I could kind of understand that, even though I politically disagreed with what Zionism was doing. But I think what this book made me realize was that my mother, who had lived through 3 partitions, the partition of Poland between the Germans and the Russians, or the Soviets, the partition of Central Asia and the Fergana Valley into Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and then the partition of Palestine into Israel and the Arab territories. My mother's memory was partitioned too. Whenever I'd ask my mother about experiences she'd had before 1948, when Israel came into being, she would talk about her Muslim neighbors as comrades. She would weep at the memory of Kamra Khan, her best friend in the Fergana Valley, who shared her mud hut after she'd been orphaned. Kamra Khan was an Uzbek Muslim girl from whom she learned a lot of her Uzbek. But when she spoke about anything after 1948, she spoke as a Zionist. And so Muslims were no longer her comrades and best friends, but her adversaries, enemies. And the fact is, most of us who have experienced partition can relate to this. I've spoken to Punjabi uncles who can sound absolutely Islamophobic and bigoted as a result of their partition experiences. And yet, you play Qawwali music around them and their eyes well up with tears because there is a deep longing for connection with neighbors who sang these, who listened to this music at a time before partition. So this book is an attempt to understand the complexity of what partition and national borders do to us psychologically, making us profess one thing in a spirit of deep political vituperation, and yet have strong affective longings for what we vituperate against. When my mother told me about Kamra Khan, she hadn't spoken about Kamra Khan to me when I was growing up, but she finally, just as she was developing Alzheimer's, told me about Kamra Khan. Her eyes welled up with tears as she remembered her dear friend from the Fergana Valley. So this is where my perception of my mother changed. I recognized that she contained multitudes. There was the mother who I argued with, who was a Zionist, but there was also the mother who had lived in proximity to Muslims and to this dear Muslim friend of hers, who she never forgot. She would remember the smell of her clothes in winter 70 years later. That suggested love, not the hatred that I'd heard in other venues. Titus Shaju asks, what was your research and writing process like while working on this book? How long did it take to uncover and weave together your mother's story with the larger history of the Silk Roads? And what do you hope readers ultimately take away from it? Well, I'll answer this fairly quickly because writing the book wasn't a quick process. I interviewed my mother when the first signs of memory loss were becoming apparent to us in 2012, and I managed to record about 39 hours of interviews where she spoke about some of the episodes that I relate in the book. But I didn't know what to do with these episodes because I didn't have the full story at hand. I still hadn't opened the Chinese tea chest. And I also don't think I was ready emotionally to write her story. It was only when Alzheimer's ravaged her memory that I felt memory is in danger of disappearing forever. Her memory is in danger of disappearing, but cultural memory about Jewish presence on the Silk Roads, about the Fergana Valley, and this extraordinary time is about to disappear forever. I did a lot of traditional academic research, but I also had to travel a lot. I spent quite a bit of time in Iran and Central Asia doing research for the book. And in some ways, the most valuable research came not from reading books or going to archives, but talking with people. A conversation I had with a vendor in the Bukhara Bazaar, where he asked me, where do I live? India. He starts singing Avarahum to me. Or going to the synagogue in Bukhara and finding out its name was Synagoga Masjidi, synagogue mosque. Or in Samarkand, going to another synagogue whose design was entirely Persian inside, with beautiful blue and white latticework designs. But the door was Turkic, Jewish, Turkic, Persian conversation. All these deeply impressed on me the extraordinarily pluralistic history of the Silk Roads cultures in the area where my mother grew up, in the Fergana Valley. What do I hope my readers will ultimately take away from this? Well, I guess it's apparent from what I've been saying. I think our imaginations have been so colonized by the nation state, which Arundhati Roy describes as a shrink-wrapping of the imagination, that we have forgotten some of the extraordinary connections of trade, of cultural exchange, but also of love with people who are not us. And because of that love, become part of who we are. I think there's a way in which we're lucky here in India. This place felt like home as soon as I moved here. I was expecting it to be exotic and strange, but it also felt curiously familiar. And it's precisely because here in India, one sees the most extraordinary diversity, not just across the subcontinent, but in any local place. I'd been taught a version of Hindi that was highly Sanskritized before I moved to India. It was ridiculously pure, or should. And it was only after I moved to India that I realized, in fact, at least in the Delhi where I live, people don't speak should Hindi, or at least they didn't when I moved here. They would instead start a thought in one language, move into a second, and often finish in a third. They would swerve, just like drivers here, between lanes. They'd start in Hindi, they'd move to English, and they'd finish in Punjabi or Urdu, with sprinklings of Bhojpuri. And that is a sign of a world that historically has its roots in the bazaar, where people from different parts of the world would come together and exchange not only goods, but also stories. I fell in love with Bollywood early on, and one of the things that I realized was that one of the dark secrets, I don't want to call it a dark secret, one of the most beautiful secrets of so-called Hindi movies, at least the movies I loved from the 70s and until about 2005, was that they weren't in should Hindi. They were in a mixture of Hindi, Urdu, English, with Punjabi thrown in, sometimes Marathi, sometimes bits and pieces of other languages. And Bollywood reflected this reality. Yes, some of the films were ridiculous. Some of the stories were ridiculous. Some of the politics were ridiculous. But the linguistic reality of Indians, I think Bollywood captured in a way that I still find so powerfully moving. It's a reminder that people would come together to sit in an audience, even though they came from different language communities, different classes, different castes. They would sit together, and those divisions could often be fiercely policed outside, but within the space of the cinema, all of a sudden, people found a way to speak with each other through the language of the film, as in a bazaar. Final question, we're almost there. Saloni Sharma asks, the memoir reflects on a cosmopolitan world where cultures once intertwined more freely. What lessons from that world do you think are most relevant today? Where do I begin? We're living at a time where not just the nation state, but the idea of the ethnic and religious nation state has become so fiercely imposed on us that it's hard not to carry with us some of the imperatives that these nation states demand of us. In terms of what we think of as our tradition, who we think of as our enemies, etc. I've spoken about it already in this video, but it bears repeating. We never come from one line. We have two parents, they each had two parents. It means our ancestry multiplies. It doesn't singularize. Even if our parents belong to the same clan, and their parents belong to that clan, and so on for hundreds of years, they still had neighbors who influenced them. And what I want us to remember is that our identities are not simply a single inheritance. They are rather dynamic and transformative consequences of conversation that is still taking place with others. We desperately need a new narrative about how to live with neighbors who are not us. That lesson is needed in Western Asia. It is needed here in the Indian subcontinent. It is needed all around the world. What has happened in Gaza has broken my heart more than anything else, and I don't hesitate to call it a genocide. It's one of the deep tragedies that a people who were at the receiving end of the most horrendous genocide have found it possible to engineer another one. But it's a reminder that no one is immune to the horrifying effects of ethno-religious nationalism, and that all of us needs to work very, very hard to remember other ways of being in the world that involve, as so many religious traditions enjoin of us, loving our neighbors, not because they're like us, not because they pray to the same gods or speak to the same language, loving them precisely because they don't, that they offer alternatives, that they expand our imaginations, that they prompt our curiosity, that they add to the possibilities for how to negotiate this increasingly complex world. I believe deeply in the muhabbat that my mother knew of in Uzbek and that I've come to know in Hindustani, that crosses borders. Nafrat is what creates them. And I really hope that humanity finds insaniyat, another Persian word that has migrated through the bazaars to the Indian subcontinent, that the world finds insaniyat as a solution to the horrors of this moment that we're living in now. Thank you very much for your interest in the book. Those of you who've not read it but who've tuned in, thank you for listening. I hope you find your way to the book and I hope you enjoy it. And thank you, Sonali's Book Club, for having me as your guest.